Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Low Production Value Sphere podcast, which is shot from my terrorist hideout in the Hindu Kush. I have a very special guest with me here today. Usually, we talk about American policy and politics, but like many of you, I care about what happens around the world. I follow what happens around the world, and I saw recently, maybe I misunderstood, but that's why we're gonna have this conversation. That in South Africa, the government passed a new law which looks very scary, and frankly makes me and not just me on social media think of Zimbabwe. It seems to be the kind of law that's designed to essentially expropriate the white minority in South Africa. Maybe I'm exaggerating. We'll see. But to explain that, I have with me Ernst Van Zyl, who works for a great organization which is called AfriForum. So, first of all, can you introduce yourself and what AfriForum is and does?
Good afternoon or evening, whenever this is aired. Thank you very much, Pascal, for having me on to discuss. I think something that's very pressing to me because it's in my backyard, but I think something that has caught a topic that has caught the attention of many, in especially the Western world. My name is Ernst Van Zyl. I also post under the brand Conscious Caracal on X and YouTube. And yeah, I'm the my main professional focus is I'm the head of public relations for AfriForum, and AfriForum is the largest civil rights organization on the African continent, particularly focusing on minority rights and the rights of Afrikaners, and also the largest community-based solutions organization on the in the southern hemisphere or in the African continent, and that's all based on the membership based that we have. We have about 315,000 donating members, and that's what gives us our power. That's what makes what we do possible. So no donations from massive multinational organizations, no billionaire donations, just the power of the people that we serve. And it gives a welcome and refreshing alternative to a lot of minority groups, and particularly Afrikaners in South Africa, that just can't really rely on party politics to save them anymore. And the pushing through of this bill into an act kind of proves that central point just once again. So sometimes people ask us, why don't you just become a political party? And our answer is, well, if you're asking that question, then you underestimate our ambitions.
Right, right. So first let's talk a bit about the background, because if you ask the sort of average European or American, they about South Africa, they remember that there was apartheid, and apartheid was very, very bad. And then apartheid stopped, and there was Nelson Mandela, and Nelson Mandela was very, very good, and everything was wonderful. And then South Africa just disappeared from the news. Because then it became somewhat less wonderful.
Well, the fairy tale
They
ended.
made
I mean, it ended with, and then everyone lived happily ever after. Why would you want to go
yes,
check back in?
yes. Well, they probably know that if you're driving through Johannesburg, you probably should like drive very fast and not stop. And they may have heard about Jacob Zuma's comments about AIDS. But putting all of that aside, basically, my understanding is that there's been a sort of narrowing and winnowing of minority rights in South Africa, and one of the things you can tell is whether minority rights is just a euphemism for white people or whether it's all minorities. I honestly don't know. Um, but yeah, could you describe that process?
Right. So South Africa is actually a country full of different minority groups. It is by far not a country that is exclusively just a black and white issue or a black and white country. It's filled with many cultural groups. There's not really one ethnic group that is the majority. But at the same time, also you should take into account I don't expect a lot of people on the outside looking in to look at South Africa and immediately grasp all its nuances and complexities. I mean, South Africa is not for beginners in political science for a reason. But when it comes to particularly minority rights in South Africa, as my friend and mentor Professor Koos Malan says, has a statist individualist constitution. So there's no room for minority rights or group rights within that constitution. Everything revolves around the individual and individual rights. But then also there's this weird, very aggressive ideology of what we call transformationism, and that is the fact that the government is constantly pushing that every facet of society, whether it be sports teams, organizations, the corporate sector, the government itself, everything needs to be 100% perfectly demographically representative. And if it's not, then the hammer of the state comes down on your whatever the target is that is not perfectly transformed. That's
Well,
the word that
certainly
they use.
Americans know nothing about that idea. It's totally unknown.
Hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it's anyway. Okay, so that's the official ideology. It's an interesting way to put it. Officially, in the law, there's individuals, there's the states. Racial minorities are not recognized as such, positively or negatively. But in practice, the government says if there's what in US law is called disparate impact, which means for whatever reason, there's not enough black people on the board of a company, for example, or whatever, we will come down on you. Okay.
Hmm. Yeah, well, we've seen many egregious examples of that. I mean, do you, your audience, know why South Africa is the only Southern African country that doesn't have a Starlink deadline?
Oh, what is that? What is that?
Because Starlink is not 30% black owned. So it's being blocked in South Africa.
That's fascinating. Well, okay, so that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. So the first step of this sort of process of gradual anti-minority efforts is BEE. So can you explain what BEE is?
Right. So BEE is the flowery language of Black economic empowerment policies, but it is pretty, and the other term that's used is triple BEE, which is just broad-based Black economic empowerment, but it's just euphemisms for racial discrimination, racially discriminatory laws, but in quotation marks, positive discrimination. So there, for some
Right.
reason, because the intentions this time around are noble, it's for some reason justified, while racial discrimination in the past by the state is one of the most cardinal evils that has ever beset the world. I mean,
Right.
you try and juggle those two assumptions. But at the same time, when it comes to South Africa, I mean, it's a country where when I tell people how many race laws are on the books in South Africa, people think I'm trolling. They think I'm joking, or they think I'm exaggerating. And then they go check for themselves and they realize, oh, well, no, actually, that's the truth. South Africa has over 141 race laws currently on the books, and 116, more than 116 of those 141 were passed after 1994. So
Right. So
that's the
somebody
reality
shared
in
a
South
chart
Africa.
on X that
Hmm.
showed, and so you can confirm this is true,
Yeah,
because
that's a chart
everything on
that
the
was
internet is true. There are more race laws on the books now than under apartheid. That's
yes,
correct.
and yeah, that chart kind of shows it very brilliantly. It's a chart that was set up by my friend Martin van Staden from the Free Market Foundation here in South Africa. He did all the research. He crunched the numbers because nobody was willing or brave enough to do it. So he's like, "Fine, I'll do it myself." So he set up and built an entire index of all the race laws in South Africa to see actually how many are there, because nobody wants to touch that topic. So he did it. So I take my hat off to Martin for doing
Yeah.
that.
And so
Um,
for those who
yeah.
don't know, that I don't know how to put a chart in a video because I'm an nincompoop. So
Mm.
I'll just describe the chart, and basically it's the number of race laws every year, and it shows a slope going up during apartheid. Apartheid ends, and there's a cliff, and then it just starts going back up, and eventually goes higher than it was
Right.
under apartheid. It's
There's pretty much just a
very
V
striking.
shape. It just goes
Yeah.
into a V. All these race
Yes.
laws get abolished, and then they immediately come back in a
Yes.
different form. So, yeah, that's the reality. There's so many examples. I mean, we could sit here for an hour, and I can just mention all the examples of these racially discriminatory laws being enacted. The most
I mean,
egregious,
give us a few examples to give us a
sure.
sense.
So, yeah, so the most egregious example would be a few years ago. There was the major pharmaceutical corporation called Dischem. It's one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in South Africa. And an internal memo leaked from the company that said, a memo went out internally that said, we are going to have to freeze any hiring or promotion of white people. Otherwise, we're going to be fined massively by the government and it will ruin us financially. That's one example. Another example would be the Tourism Relief Fund. So during COVID, the government set up a tourism sector relief fund for any businesses, small businesses in the tourism sector that were struggling or going under due to the COVID-19 lockdowns. But there was a catch: you can only successfully apply for funding to save your business if the management of your business is not too white. If your
So
management is too white,
this is COVID relief. So
COVID
this
relief.
is
Yeah.
not a handout that would be nice to have. It's like it's
No, it's
money
like
that you need
this
to
is what's
survive
standing between your
because of
business going
government
under or not.
policy. Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Hmm.
Wow.
So yeah, that's the other thing. Luckily, AfriForum and our sister organization Solidarity were able to challenge this discriminatory fund in court, and we won. So that fund was then never enacted, the racially discriminatory element of it.
Yeah.
But the government did attempt it. Another very prominent example would be the Starlink example that I just mentioned, and then also the Tears Foundation, which is an organization that fights gender-based violence in South Africa. They applied for funding from the government because the government funds many of these types of organizations, and the government refused to barred funding to them because their management is too white.
Okay.
An organization that
So
fights gender-based violence.
yes. Well, yeah. So my favorite B fact, and you will confirm that that's true, is that Chinese nationals count as black under BEE. So one of the stories that's been going on in South Africa is that, as in most places in Africa for the past 10 years, China has been investing a lot, and this is not benign investment. It's not just financial investment. It's investment that seeks political influence. And so Chinese national, and so B says you need to have a minimum number of black, shareholders, directors, blah blah blah. And so Chinese nationals count as black under.
Right.
So it just shows that the entire thing is a sham, and it's just, I mean, from what I see, it seems directed at just at white people. It's like it doesn't care. It doesn't really even matter if you're helping like people who suffered under apartheid, which okay, that's understandable. But if you're just like, you know, if it's just naked anti-white racism, that's something very different.
Hmm. Yeah, well, BEE or racially discriminatory policies by the South African government really just serves two purposes. On the one side, it serves the purpose of punishing white people for things that people did in the past that looked like them, and the second thing that it accomplishes is that it creates a system of patronage for those who are
Yes.
that have the right political connections. BEE is and Black economic empowerment policies are an exclusive club in South Africa, and 99% of the population is not in it.
Right, right. That's also an important point, which is that the black people, even when they're black, the black people who benefit from BEE are not like some broad representative segment of the population. They're like
Hmm.
a small politically connected class.
It's
Uh,
just a new ethnic elite or racial
yeah,
elite, basically, that's been
yeah.
created.
Okay. Another issue that's related to this, that people or you'll tell me if it's related or not, is the issue of so-called farm murders.
Right.
And when people hear about this at first, they think, well, I know that there's a lot of crime in South Africa. Farms are isolated. People get attacked. That's very sad, but it's a crime problem. And there may be a racial element to it because many farmers are white, but that's not the same thing. But what I learned speaking to somebody and again, you can correct me if this is wrong, is basically there's a kind of legal pretext, which is essentially like anybody can say, oh, my great grandfather used to own this land, therefore this land is now mine, and you can just make up the claim. And so if the farmer doesn't allow himself to be expropriated, you can kill him, and then there's no legal recourse because am I understanding this correctly?
Well, I mean that's more on the off the record side. So I think it's a lot of it is more speculation than anything else. When it comes
Okay.
to I mean, I'm going to try and not speculate too much, but when it comes to
Okay.
what we actually have the most proof of, when it comes to the farm murder connection to the land debate, when politicians in South Africa constantly just frame farmers as like these descendants of rapists and thieves and genociders and whatever you want to call them. I mean, they've been called everything under the sun, and they are constantly referred to as land thieves residing on land that was stolen. Then I'm not
And of course,
surprised.
African tribes, never engaged in warfare or land theft
Well, it's funny
hundreds
that
of
you
years
say
ago.
that because
That's only white people have ancestors who engaged in warfare centuries ago.
it's funny that you put it that way because that's literally how many politicians in South Africa describe the pre-colonial past. They describe it as this
Right.
utopia Eden where there's no strife, there's no conflict, there's advanced technology. It's all this like ancient aliens level, but just Afro nationalism. But when it comes to particularly the again that connection to farm murders, I mean, I'm not surprised when high profile politicians with millions of followers are constantly villainizing and antagonizing farmers as these evil descendants of evil people
Yeah.
that deserve retribution. Then in a population of 60 million people, you're going to get people that are just going to say, well, I just hate these people so much, I'm going to take it into my own hands to enact justice.
Right.
But on this other side, it's almost impossible to prove what the motives are of people that
Right.
do a lot of these
Right.
farm murders, because if when you're in a court case, the only way to prove what someone's motive is to really hear them say this is what motivated me. But when they're in the wit or when they're being cross-examined in their court case, the last thing they're going to do is say, yes, I was motivated by like pure
Right.
hatred and a
Right.
desire to murder, because that's
Right.
going to ensure that you at first you lose your case, and secondly you get the heaviest sentence possible. So
Yes.
no, the vast majority of farm attackers and farm murderers are obviously going to say, "Oh, I was motivated by the farmer was racist to me, or it was a labor dispute, or I was just looking for it was a robbery gone wrong." It's always going to be a trying to gain sympathy through the
Right.
story. So unfortunately, I wish we could get the statistics on what the motive for majority of farm murders are, but it
Right.
is, I wouldn't say
Right.
near impossible. It is impossible to get those statistics because you
Right.
can't extract the motives from the majority of people due
And
to
and
the
and and
incentives.
what about the other side? What about the enforcement? Like, is it the case that I honestly don't know. Like, I don't know how many.
Hmm.
Is the police 100% black? And if so, if you go, and you say my father was murdered, I need you to investigate this. Do they actually investigate it? If they don't investigate, is it because they're incompetent, or is it because there's a political will to sort of look the other way?
Hmm. I think again, it's very difficult to discern exactly what's going on in people's hearts when it comes to
Yes.
the South African Police
But
Service.
you
What
can
we
get
do
a
know,
sense, right?
yeah,
And you
what we
and
do know
some
for a
some
fact.
crimes are investigated more
Hmm.
and more thoroughly than others, right? And
Hmm.
partly that's just because people are human and bureaucracies are
Hmm.
flawed, but sometimes it's also deliberate, or you can get a sense that it's deliberate.
Yeah. So the two factors that I think stand out here that are the most matter of fact is firstly the fact that the South African Police Service refuses to classify farm murders as a priority crime. So a
Okay.
priority crime is a class of crime in South Africa that gets special attention, it gets its own task force, it gets a special amount of resources, it gets because it is a unique
Right.
crime with unique in a unique context with unique effects and uniquely devastating effects on the community. Examples of priority crimes in South Africa are gang-related crimes, rhino poaching, cash and transit heists. But the South African Police Service refused to.
I'm sorry for laughing. I mean, rhino poaching
Yeah,
is very bad and should be stopped. But the idea that rhino poaching is a priority crime and farm
yeah.
workers aren't is
And
just
yeah, so I mean that gives you enough information about how seriously
yes,
they take the
yes.
issue.
Okay, okay,
The South African Police Service refuses to classify it as a priority crime, and then also to add to that, the prosecution rate, the successful prosecution rate is horrendous. I don't have the stats here in front of me, but it's a vast minority of farm murder cases. There's actually a successful conviction. But I mean that can also just be down to incompetence here. You wouldn't
yes,
know, but I mean, I think the most glaring fact is the fact that the police just refuses to classify farm
right.
murders with the label and the severity that it deserves.
A general rule of thumb is that if your country becomes internationally known for a specific kind of crime, that should be a high priority.
Right.
And I say this, I live in France. It's not like we don't have reputation problems when it comes to public safety. But although the Brits are beating us at this, it's a strong, they sort of they were way behind us and they've overtaken us at great speed. Um, so I guess so we you want to I guess I should have said this at the time. I want to try to strike a balance when we have this conversation.
Hmm.
When, on the one hand, not hiding, not refusing to see what's there when you're naming realities of race, when somebody is targeted because of their race, and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, you don't want to raise the racial temperature. You don't want to incite conflict. So the a lot of the background for this is that in any country, when you have minorities, particularly when those minorities tend to be sort of more socioeconomically successful, there's a political incentive for the majority group, the politicians of the majority group, to sort of demagogue those minorities and sort of say, "Oh, we're gonna, and that's a phenomenon you see throughout history in every country. It's not a specifically black thing. It's not a specifically anything. It's just the way the incentives of the politics works. But unfortunately, that's what we've seen in South Africa. Would you say that's a correct assessment?
Well, in South Africa, that's the easiest scapegoat to help you get away if you're a politician with
Right.
all your other failings, is just to blame the very visible and very disproportionately successful minority groups. And in particular, Afrikaners are a highly visible minority group that is disproportionately successful. So it's very easy to scapegoat that type of minority. But when it comes to particularly the type of rhetoric that we see from or hear from politicians, it can't be more explicit in regards to how
Right.
anti-Afrikaner it is, anti-Afrikaans, the language of Afrikaners. Um, it's a lot of them don't even hide it. I mean, a politician
Right.
like Julius Malema, the head of the EFF, he'll chant
Right.
kill the boer, kill the farmer. I mean, that's
Right.
the most direct call to violence that you can imagine.
Yes.
And then the rest of his friends and allies in parliament just shrug it off and say, "Ah, it's just a metaphor." But my one of my favorite political cartoons to explain the failings in this argument is just these two farm murderers run. The picture is these two farm murderers running out from a crime scene, and the one looks at the other one and he asks him, "What's a metaphor?"
uh, there's a famous scene in a French movie where one guy says something and he says it's a metaphor, and his friend says, "Oh, that's not a metaphor, that's a simile," and he says, "Shove it," and the first guy says, "That's a metaphor." Okay,
Yeah.
so I just we spent some time talking about this, but not everybody follows South Africa. But I think it was important to sort of set the stage and explain
Mhm.
that you have a political system where you have an incentive, political, economic, to sort of demonize minority groups, and you have a sort of background where there's a sense of the boiling frog, right? You have a sense of sort of slowly climbing temperature in terms
Hmm.
of the either direct state or state abetted hostility, and that's the sort of background. So that's where this law comes in, and so now you can explain like what the law is, what it says specifically, and so on and so forth.
Right. So I think if you've been anywhere on X in the political spheres, especially with international news and international politics, you would have definitely noticed that there's some ruckus going on in South Africa. There's some noise being made, and it's with good reason, seeing as the government here has signed into law. A bill that very, very seriously threatens private property rights in this country. And expropriation without compensation is nothing new. It's not the first time you hear that term. It's not the first time that policy is tabled. We saw it happen in Zimbabwe, just in the neighboring country in South Africa. And we saw the devastating
Right.
effects in Venezuela as well of this type of policy. And when it comes to the Zimbabwean case study, our government, the ANC, does not see ZANU PF, the leading party in Zimbabwe, as the bad guys. They see them as applaudable. They see them as the good guys. They see them
Right.
as their heroes and people that they want to emulate. And it's not. It's one of those things where you don't even have to go dig in the archives to find those quotes. They say this explicitly very regularly. They celebrate Robert Mugabe as a hero. So that's the first thing that really doesn't reassure people in South
Right.
Africa when it comes to the whole debate around land. So what did the government do here? Well, firstly, there is a bit of a timeline that's important, but I'll keep it as condensed as possible. So in 2018, the government pushes for the amendment of the South African Constitution, the more particularly Section 25 of the Constitution. So Section 25 of the South African Constitution protects private property rights and prohibits expropriation without compensation. And then the government pushes to
As
try and
the
amend it.
constitution of every democracy on the
Mm,
planet and every just country. I mean, I was reading the French Declaration of Human Rights recently for something else, and like this is one of the provisions: no expropriation without compensation. This is like a
mm.
because otherwise it's just state theft.
No,
Anyway, go on. So in 2018 they
they
amended
tried
the
to amend it,
constitution.
yeah.
Oh, they
So in
tried.
2018,
Okay.
they pushed to amend it. They fail in parliament for the funniest reason ever. So they have enough support in parliament from their own party plus the radical left wing parties in the parliament to be able to push this through with a 2/3 majority. But they fail because the radical left wing parties in parliament say that the amendment does not go far enough, so they refuse to vote for it. And in the end, South Africa and particularly landowners and property owners in South Africa are saved by the hubris of the Marxist Leninists. So I'm very grateful for that. But then, in the wake of this defeat, so now the attempt to amend the constitution fails. In the wake of this defeat, the South African government very clearly communicates: all right, this has now failed. We are going to we are now going to immediately start pursuing the alternative tools at our disposal to make expropriation without compensation possible. What is the first backdoor that they try? They table
Okay,
the
so, hang on. So, for many, many years since 2018, the government has at least stated the intention of making expropriation without compensation a reality. So this is
yes,
this is not just something that dropped out of the sky
no,
yesterday. For many,
no,
many years, the government of South Africa has been saying we want to do this.
yeah,
Okay, carry
yeah.
on.
So the next phase is then they're like, all right, we're going to try the next back door that they try, or alternative avenue to the same ends, is they table the expropriation bill. So the expropriation bill is not a very covert attempt at all to do the same thing. It just says it wants to make expropriation with no compensation possible. That's what we call a synonym. That's what we call a euphemism for.
So Okay, am I understanding this correctly? They replaced the word without by the words with no, and they thought that that was
They
different.
replaced without with null, zero.
Oh, I see. Okay, so you get compensation, and the amount of the compensation is zero.
Yes, because the government has done its sums very responsibly and came to the conclusion that they're not going to compensate you. So
Ah,
it's
I
not tyrannical
see.
at all. It's
Very,
not.
very clever. Very clever.
And
All
so
right.
that's what the bill does. It enables expropriation with null compensation, and that bill then passes through Parliament, and then
So that bill passed.
it passes through Parliament, and it goes to the president's desk, and he just needs to sign it to turn it into a law. And then in December he signs it, and it's announced a week ago. So the the bill is now signed into law. But yeah, there's still a very long process or a fight that's still going to unfold now. But to
Right.
just
So
some,
the bill passed, but
Mhm.
they failed to amend the Constitution, so it's
Yes,
plainly unconstitutional.
yes, that's why there's a very
Okay.
strong chance that a very strong legal grounds to take it to test its constitutionality in court, which AfriForum
Okay.
will be doing.
Okay. So not an expert on the South African Constitution. So how do you have? I assume there's some form of judicial review, but how does it work?
Hmm. So there's many routes, but I think the most conventional one, which AfriForum will be taking, is first you take it to the High Court. Do you constitutionally test it in the High Court? But the High Court cannot. The High Court, when it if the High Court finds it to be unconstitutional, that has to be supported, or what would be the right verb? It has to be confirmed, or that judgment needs to be confirmed or backed by the Constitutional Court as well. If your challenge in the High Court fails, you can take it to the Supreme Court of Appeal. If it fails in the Supreme Court of Appeal, you can take it to the Constitutional Court, which is the highest court in the land. It's pretty much the South African Supreme Court, and that's
Okay.
the final arena where your case is heard. But AfriForum's challenge is going to start in the High Court, and we're going to see where it goes from there. But yeah, there's a very strong constitutional challenge to be made, seeing as the government failed to amend the constitution, which really hamstrings their opportunity to get away with
Right.
expropriation without compensation, without a very serious and legitimate legal challenge.
Okay. So and I assume that would strengthen the case because at first they said we need to change the Constitution to do this.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
and then when they couldn't, they were like, "Oh no, we don't need to change the Constitution." Like
Yeah.
that. Anyway,
Yeah,
uh,
their argument will boil down or boils down to that the Constitution already implicitly allows expropriation without compensation. But it's a very shaky argument. But I mean, I understand why they make that type of argument in South Africa, because in South Africa, the South African case proves a very important point, and that is that no constitution is supreme. It is the
yes,
sovereignty or power does not lie within the constitution, the document. It
yes,
lies within the hands of whoever is
yes,
interpreting the constitution. So,
yes.
and in South Africa, I mean, the ANC has done a lot of horrible and destructive things, but they have given us one term that I think is very useful. In South Africa, the ANC talks about the balance of forces. So everything is determined by the balance of forces. If the balance of forces are on your side, you win. If they're against you, you lose. And if the balance of forces are not in your favor yet, you wait and build up the balance of forces until they are in your favor. Then you move forward. So when it comes to their challenge here with this expropriation bill, they are clearly signaling that they think, even though the Constitution does not allow expropriation without compensation, the ruling party is signaling that they think they have enough balance of forces on their side to push it through anyway. It's that whole idea of de facto reality versus de jure reality. In South Africa
Right.
and many other countries where you have deteriorating state power and deteriorating sovereignty of the constitution, you see this manifest where if there's enough real world force in a certain direction, it can almost
Indeed.
override the constitution without any amendment being made to the constitution itself.
Yeah. I mean, I this is a uh very different issue, but it's sort of famous that in the United States, the Supreme Court, especially the Chief Justice, chose not to strike down Obamacare because on legal grounds that were so he justified his decision with a legal reasoning that was so flimsy that it hadn't occurred to anybody. So for these big constitutional cases in the US, you don't just have an side for and against, but you have amicus briefs, which means third organizations can write and say, oh, this is what we think about this case. So you had like 30 different legal arguments for and against, and like he found something that nobody had thought of. And it's a sort of open secret that the reason why he did that is because he believed that if he hadn't, the political backlash against the Supreme Court, because it would have been seen as a partisan Republican decision, would have been
Mm.
too great. And so it was essentially a political. And this is one example, but of course there's
Yeah.
countless, because
And
judges
the
are not
message that
perfect.
is sent there, or the reality that is proven there, is that the institution or individual that can override the Constitution is the person to which the Constitution, or institution to which the Constitution, is subordinate.
Yes. So okay, so I'm since your organization has this case pending,
Mm.
I'm not going to ask you to evaluate the quality of courts in South Africa.
Hmm.
So we'll just push that aside. A different question is, okay, so governments, politicians, they'll say all sorts of things that they don't plan on doing, right? They
Mm.
do them, or that they plan on doing in only a sort of superficial way, right? It's like, again, in the American context, the president would say, oh, we don't like criminal immigrants. So they pass a law, and they go and they grab, five guys with lots of cameras looking at them, and they throw out five guys. But in reality,
Mm.
everybody knows the border's still open, or something like that. Like, I guess my question is about the political situation.
Mm.
Is it the government just pandering and they don't really want to do this, or do they want to take take white people's property to just
Mm.
steal it through raw state power because they've decided to do that?
I think the most accurate assessment would be to say that they want the power to be able to do it. How far they will take it, how quickly they will use that power, I mean, that's up to speculation. There's no way to say. But what you can
Okay.
see for a fact is that it's that power that they want, the option to want. They want that weapon in their hand. Whether they're going to swing that weapon, that's a different issue. That's a different piece of speculation. But I
So
think the best, yeah.
this raises another question, which is about the law itself. Is it the law that empowers the government, or is it a law that empowers, individuals or groups to say, oh, the example I took earlier, oh, your farm is on my ancestors' land, and therefore
Hmm.
I can ask the court to give me your farm, and they probably will.
Hmm. The law itself empowers the government and many levels of it to expropriate. So it doesn't empower private individuals or groups or organizations to. It empowers the state to do it. But as we saw in Zimbabwe, there sometimes the line between land grabs and expropriation by the
Yeah.
state just blurs and becomes the
Yeah.
same thing. You can't really see where the state has a hand and where it's just organic land grabs going on. So that's the thing. And I think the best way to look at it metaphorically would be you have a room full of people, a crowded room, and a terrorist walks in with an AK-47. And AfriForum and the other organizations that are taking this bill on, or this law on, are the guy that shouts, "Look out, he has a gun!" And this
Right.
guy is shouting, "I'm going to kill everyone." And then the government and their lackeys are the people that say, "Don't worry. I mean, what, you're just overreacting. He hasn't shot anyone yet. He's just a
Right.
security guard."
Right. Right. The analogy to a hostage situation is an interesting one, because you can say, oh, he doesn't, if he just gets what he wants, he's not going to shoot everybody and it's going to be
Right.
fine. But you go into the bank, okay? I'll just stay here and watch,
No.
and also
Well,
sometimes
that and the law stays on forever if it's not challenged, which
right,
means that maybe, I mean, I don't believe the current South African government is moderate by any means, but let's say it's possible to even
can
go
always
even
have
more
worse.
extreme than the current one,
Right,
because the ANC is a very explicitly leftist party, but there's like far left parties that even
right,
that's are even more extreme than the ANC that are not in power.
right,
If one of them were to gain power, they would absolutely use this law as well to the maximum
right,
extent that it can.
right,
So even though I do believe the ANC is definitely not the moderate party that's not going to use this law, it's absolutely in them to use and abuse
right,
this law. The option is still there that if they don't do it, someone else might also. I don't want the state to have that power ever, whether the state is managed by my favorite party or the worst party on the planet. I don't want it to have the power to take any form of property without compensation.
right. I get. I'm going to ask an extremely naive question,
Sure, go for it.
which is, why would anybody think that's a good idea? Because, like, you have a population of people in your country. They're productive. They start businesses. They run businesses. They pay taxes. They make your country's economy better. Why would you kill the goose that lays the golden eggs? I mean, it is purposefully an extremely naive question. I guess the less naive version
Mm.
of it is like, do they understand that if they just like completely drive white people away from South Africa, like the country's going to fall apart?
Mm. So my two answers there is the one answer. First answer is definitely the quote from my AfriForum colleague Barend Ace, who says, "I think some people there's still a lot of people out there that don't realize the ANC are willing to destroy the entire country to hold on to power." That's the one
Okay,
thing. And the second aspect is the fact that this is not a popular policy in South Africa. The vast majority of South Africans don't have a hunger for land. They are not
right.
looking for a piece of land to farm on. And the best example to prove that is the fact that when it comes, so there has already been a lot of restitution of land. So a restitution process has been in place in South Africa where if you can go to the government and prove that you were dispossessed by the previous regime, your family were dispossessed by the previous regime, you can, and you have the proof, you can prove it, you get that land back, but the person who is in current possession of that land gets compensation. It's not expropriated without compensation. They get
Got
fair
it.
compensation, but the people putting in the land claim get their land back.
Right.
In that process, since
And
1998,
and and what happens to the productivity of the farms that are then redistributed?
90, according to the government statistics, 90% of them fail and don't become productive. So according to the government statistics, when it comes to the restitution process, and these statistics were released just a few months ago, uh, since 1998 there have been thousands of successful land claims and land restitution. Out of those thousands and thousands of successful restitution claims, 87% of those who made successful claims took money instead of the land when given the opportunity. So when
I
you have a successful application for to get your land back, the government says, "All right, you've been successful. You can now choose. You either get the value of the land in cash now, or you can get the land itself." And 87% of land claimants chose the
Yeah.
money rather than the land.
And it makes sense. Like, if I won a farm in the lottery or something,
Yeah,
uh, I would just sell it for the money. I'm not a farmer, and I
right.
don't particularly want to be a farmer. I admire farmers, but I'm not a farmer. I never wanted particularly to be a farmer. I think every man dreams of being a farmer occasionally, but um, so it does make sense. Um, okay, so I want to go back to a thing you said, which is the ANC will destroy the country rather than lose power. So the
Right.
ANC is Mandela's party. We're not going to go into the whole thing,
Mm,
like what are the origins of the ANC and what it did
mm,
historically, but it's been the party that's been in power in South Africa since the end of apartheid. And of course, again, trying to sort of deracialize this. It's not healthy in any country with any sort of racial configuration for the same party to be in power for 30 years and to have a kind of electoral monopoly. It breeds complacency, it breeds corruption, and so on and so forth. So, is that why this is happening now? Is the ANC rule threatened? Is like what? I guess the question I'm asking is why now? What's the political
Mm.
context?
Right. So you're absolutely correct. Since the end of apartheid, the ANC has been in power until the elections of 2024. So in the elections of 2024,
Ah,
the ANC lost their majority support, but then they formed a coalition with other minority
right.
parties, and they formed, as they call it, a government of national unity. It sounds very beautiful. And now that government of national unity is ruling, but the ANC is still getting everything that it wants. It's still pushing through. It's still ruling as
The
if it's in
ANC is
charge.
the dominant party in the coalition.
It's a
Okay,
40% party in a coalition with other with one 20% party and other like 5% parties.
right. So
Yeah,
so that's so essentially the ANC is pushing this bill to be like, look at us, we're the most black nationalists, and sort of
we're
trying to
still a
regain its
revolutionary
authority.
party of the people. Yes, a race
Okay,
populist and an economic populist party, but not in the
okay,
based way. No,
okay. And so yes, and so they don't care if it destroys the country as long as
no.
it's sort of
They are just
restored their
desperate
image.
to regain their grip on power because they've been seriously weakened. They've been weakened from a 60% party to a 40% party.
Yes, that's a big
So they have to
difference.
get back
And
above 50% as quickly as possible.
and what is it just general dissatisfaction with, I mean, the state, I mean, again, like, you know this, I don't know if people watching this know this, but the state of infrastructure in South Africa has been sort of consistently declining, the state of public services, public safety, certainly, and so on. Is it just general dissatisfaction? And if so, where are the votes going? I imagine they're going to other black nationalist parties. Are they
Mm.
going, so the sort of the party that's, and again, you will correct me if I'm wrong, but there's the party called the DA, which is, they're very at pains of pointing of saying they're not the white party. They're certainly the most Western party. They're a sort of European style moderate party that wants sort of race neutral policies and so on and so forth. But they're de facto the white party. I assume they're not the beneficiaries of the ANC's uh, electoral woes.
Right. So, what again? It's actually a fascinating story what happened there, and we can maybe talk about it in more detail on another day. But summed up, what happened is it's not, and I'm pretty sure about this. You won't hear this from a lot of analysts because it's not a very popular analysis of what happened. But it is absolute. I'm almost 100% sure this is what happened, just based on this and on seeing with my own two eyes. It's not, people didn't stop voting for the ANC because of their failures in regard and their corruption and the rolling blackouts and the out of control crime and the infrastructure falling apart. If that was the reason, their downfall would have come a lot earlier. They were dropping in support every, so we have elections every 5 years, which means we when it came to the ANC support between elections, they were dropping support in about at about a rate of 3% per every 5 years, and then suddenly they lose 20%. But we've had rolling blackouts for more than 17 years. We've had corruption
Right.
scandals for decades. We've had crumbling infrastructure for decades. So, what did everyone just wake up suddenly in that mythical, like the masses woke up moment in 2024? No, I don't believe in that fairy tale. I don't think that's how mass democracy works. What happened was the ANC was on track to lose again about 3 or 2% in support if you look at the graph or trends on how they were losing
Right.
support. And then there was this massive, like catastrophic fracture internally, where, again, as I say, there's a fascinating history around this, but I'll have to condense it for the sake of time. So the ANC is not an ethnically united party. There are Xhosas and Zulus and many other different ethnic groups in there, And it's always been a traditionally Xhosa dominated party. But
Yes.
then when Jacob Zuma, the
Mandela
previous
was
president,
Xhosa.
came in, he was more of a Zulu nationalist. So he filled the
Yes.
party top
Yes.
ranks with Zulus and made it more of a Zulu party. He gained a lot of support in KwaZulu Natal, which is the province with the most Zulus in it. And then he was ousted in 2018, and Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president, who is a Venda, took over. And Vendas are like this tiny little micro minority ethnic wise. So the Zulus are not happy. The Zulu base of the ANC were not happy, and because as soon as Zuma gets kicked out, all the Zulus get purged again from like an ethnic purge from the party. They lose all their positions, get replaced by people of other ethnicities. So what happens is Zuma, now in exile from the ANC, he cancels his ANC membership and he forms this new party called Umkhonto weSizwe, or the Spear of the Nation, the MK party, a radical, like, revolutionary ethno-nationalist party, but not. This is, again, there's
And
so much
the name
detail here, but
MK
I'll
is a throwback to the ANC's arms
that was the
wing.
military terrorist wing of the ANC, yes,
Yes.
the Umkhonto weSizwe, yes. So what happened was, so within the Zulu nation, within the Zulu people, there's this divide between the traditional ethno-nationalists or the monarchists, the Zulu kingdom. I mean, there's still a Zulu
Yes.
king who
Yes.
wields a
There's a
massive
Zulu
amount of
traditional
power.
king and so on and so
Yeah.
forth. Yes.
He's not just some figurehead, he's a genuinely powerful figure,
Yes.
commands the loyalty of millions of people.
Yes.
And so there's that faction, which is then
Which, as a
represented.
French, quasi-monarchist, I totally
Yeah.
respect. By the way, that's
I
the
also
most
don't have a problem
respectable
with
thing in the
the.
South African political system.
I don't have a problem with the Zulu monarchy either. But when it comes to, and then their political representation is the Inkatha Freedom Party, which is also the traditionalist conservative
Yes.
Zulu ethno nationalist party. Then you get the MK party, which the traditional comment class find it almost incapable to describe what they are. They just kind of describe them as just traditional, like in the Western lexicon, they'd just be called like ethno fascists or Zulu supremacists or whatever. But it's not.
No.
That loses a lot of the nuance, because, as I said, they are the traditional, like, Zulu nationalists, the IFP and the monarchy. And then you have this MK party, which is the best way I can describe them, if I have to give them a label, is like the secular ethno nationalists. So they're not traditionalists, they're not monarchists. They're like they're pretty much a strand of these left wing ethno nationalists that you see throughout history, that don't have a religious connotation. They don't have a connection to the old history of the country, or to the traditional monarchy or traditional centers of authority. They're almost like a subversive force that parasitizes, like, cultural nationalism or ethnic nationalism. And I would say that's what the MK party is. But anyway, long story short, this MK party, or this Zulu revolution within the ANC, breaks away, and they immediately gain like 14% of the vote, which is unheard of in South Africa. I mean, we've had many breakaway parties from the ANC, but they've never gotten more than 5% of the support, and then they disappear. But this party comes onto the scene immediately, within a few months, just gains 14% of the vote, and they force the ANC to drop to 40%. That's my diagnosis. What happened? It's not because people got fed up with the ANC. It's not because people say, well, this is now enough is enough.
Okay.
I'm not going to vote for the ANC this time. No, they just, the ANC, the Zulus within the ANC voter base defected. It's like, for example, the Texans defecting from the Republican Party in
Right. To
the,
some sort of third party.
yeah, and being
Uh,
wildly successful. So
and
yeah.
in Germany, the Bavarian party is the CSU. Like, they have their own party. It's de facto in an alliance with the national sort of center right party, but it's a different party. It's their own party. Theoretically, they could make up their own bloc. Okay, so and by the way, if you have time, we can sort of go slightly over the hour.
Sure.
So the next question is, the most important question is, what happens now? But that's sort of indeterminate, because it depends on this constitutional challenge. And again, like, I'm sort of, again, asking the naive questions, which is like, if I'm like a political advisor to the ANC, I will say, pass this ridiculous law. It's going to get struck down in the courts, and that way you get the political benefit. You can say you tried, but you don't destroy the economy, um, and that's good. So, is that what's going on? If that's not what's going on, like
Hmm.
if you win, it's like, okay, play another game. If you lose, what happens?
Hmm. So if we win, then our challenge against the Expropriation Act, then we go fight. Then we can focus all our resources on fighting all the other destructive policies of the ANC that they're forcing through. Then we have some extra resources lying around to go redirect. If we lose, that means that the government gains the power to be able to expropriate property, any property, without compensation. Or no, let's use their language, with no compensation, not the same thing. Right.
Right, right.
So yeah, that's the two scenarios, and I think
Yeah,
again, this is what makes AfriForum such a robust organization, because we were created within that political milieu of the idea of the balance of forces that I talked about earlier. Everything, reality is dependent on how much force and influence you can wield,
right,
not necessarily on whether you are the ruling party or not, or whether you are in government or not.
right.
That's how politics works in South Africa. It's how politics works I think, on the African continent in general. Is if you create a de facto reality, de jure reality kind of follows.
Yeah,
That's the model that AfriForum follows, and it has we've been applying that philosophy to great effect and great success.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
I guess I don't, I don't want you to say anything that you don't want to say publicly, but I guess, a question that I kind of want to
mhm.
ask is like, if the government like actually starts to just like take people's property,
Mm,
like, are people gonna take it? I mean, there's a level like of injustice in a government that sort of legitimizes resistance. Like, my great grandfather was the leader of the French resistance in our area of Burgundy, and I'm very proud of the fact that he resisted a unjust tyrannical government. And speaking of expropriation, we now live in the house that was the local Wehrmacht headquarters. So, I mean, I don't want you to sort of get ahead of your
mm,
skis, but there. I mean, if
mm.
some totally undemocratic, corrupt government decides one day that it can just take my house, I'm not going to let them.
Right. So there's two facets to that. On the one side, if the government starts expropriating property without compensation, AfriForum will be the first organization to defend those property owners in court, and they will not have to go at it alone. If that fails, if the court challenge fails, then then we follow the porcupine approach, where we're not a aggressor, we're not an attacker, but if you mess with the porcupine, you're going to get a face full of quills. And I mean, that's how it works in Africa. That's the only way to really keep off predators, is to have a very, very strong defensive strategy. And I think when it comes to AfriForum in particular, we're not just an organization that fights in the courts. We're also one of the largest community-based security networks in South Africa, if not in Africa. We've got 177 neighborhood watches all across the country, and it's not your grandma's neighborhood watch with pepper spray and whatever. It's highly well
I'm sure.
trained.
I'm sure it's not. I'm sure it's not.
It's well
I'm sure people
trained,
can check out the
well
videos.
equipped.
They're a lot more exciting than this one, I can tell you.
Yeah, so we've got a network of neighborhood watches all across the country, community safety structures, as we call them. They're highly equipped, they're highly trained, and they're ready to oppose tyranny if it were to come to that, where the government just throws law and order to the wind and says, well, we're just going to start confiscating property. Doesn't matter what's right or wrong. It comes down to that idea that the whole essence of law is the fact that it is rooted in justice. Therefore, an
Yes.
unjust law cannot
Yes.
be a law that should be followed. And I mean, that's
Yes.
the thing. If the government just starts confiscating property, no matter what, then people will follow the porcupine approach, the porcupine defensive strategy, and we all know who started it.
Right. Right. All right. Well, very well. Message received. Uh, I mean, we were talking before we started recording, and I mentioned that I used to travel to Africa a fair amount,
Hmm.
though never South Africa. I mean, I think you know. Um, there's a lot of people who left, and it's difficult to blame them. But I also understand, like, people. I don't think people who have never been to Africa can understand just how achingly beautiful it is, and how it's a continent that you can just fall in love with.
Hmm. Yeah, I
And
mean,
especially
my
if your ancestors have been there for centuries.
mm,
So yeah, there's plenty of Afrikaners, who are doctors or whatever, and they can get much better jobs,
mm,
much better paid, and they don't have to drive around in an armored car when they get home from work. Although in London that may be changing. But there's also people who have been living in your land who have been there for centuries, and their ancestors were not purely evil by the standards of anything else. Certainly not by the standards of African tribal warfare. Um, and, and they're very attached to it. And I mean, there's no question. I guess the thing I'm willing to I want to communicate, and maybe you can touch on that, and we can end there unless you have something else to say. Um, but basically, like, I deeply understand why people want to fight for South Africa as a land, as a place which has amazing natural resources, beauty, uh, was once a first world country, and could be again, and not necessarily under an apartheid state, just competent government. If South Africa just had competent government and didn't try to attack any race, it would be a wonderful country. It would be like France. It would be like Switzerland, except even more beautiful. I mean, Switzerland and France are very beautiful, but with its own specific kind of beauty. Yeah.
well, I think then what I'll end on is just a personal note as well. I mean, my ancestors have been here since 1688. I'm the ninth generation in Southern Africa. My first ancestor was a French Huguenot that came here in 1688 called Paul Roux. And yeah, that's my story, and that's the story of all Afrikaners when you really dig beneath the surface. Most Afrikaners' ancestors came to South Africa before the United States was a country. And yes, a lot of Afrikaners have left. There's a massive Afrikaner diaspora out there, but the vast majority of Afrikaners still live in South Africa. There's still millions of us here, and there will always be
Yes.
millions of Afrikaners here because millions of Afrikaners have chosen either do not want to leave or cannot leave. That's the other reality. To immigrate, you have to kind of give up everything you have and start from
Yes.
scratch in a new place, especially with how weak the rand now is, our currency towards the
Right.
dollar
Right.
or the
Right.
euro.
Right.
When it comes to what the future holds, well, the future holds that Afrikaners are kind of leading the way in many ways. I mean, we had a visitor here, Tier de Meester from America, that came to check out what we're doing here. And he observed that South Africa and Afrikaners are way ahead of the curve for two different reasons. South Africa, unfortunately, due to many of the problems that we are facing, might be the same problems might start emerging in the Western world as Western countries South Africanize. But at the
Yes.
same time,
Indeed.
Afrikaners are ahead of the curve because we're already developing and pioneering the solutions to the problems associated with South Africa. One of those examples would
That's a
be
very good point.
AfriForum and the associated solidarity movement, where we're not relying on party politics anymore. Where it doesn't mean you should disregard party politics, doesn't mean you should just write off democracy. It just means you have to do more. Just going to vote is the bare minimum you can do to bring about change. You should be doing a lot more. You should be getting involved, building your own institutions, starting organizations, organizing as a community. That's what Afrikaners have been forced to do, and to this point, we've been very successful. We've pioneered many new ways of bringing about change outside of the party politics system. So when party politics fails, we didn't put all our eggs in that one basket. I mean, just to take AfriForum as an example, we have 177 community-based security structures all across the country. We have 170 branches all across the country that fill thousands of potholes and paint street signs and plant trees and repair infrastructure and fix water leaks, everything where the government is failing.
That's
And we're
wonderful.
just one node within the solidarity movement. The solidarity movement is is an Afrikaner movement that covers many different facets of South Africa. So in the solidarity movement, you have Help in the Hunt, Solidarity Helping Hand, which is our welfare organization that helps children that can't go to school, don't have money to go to school or to go to university. We have built Soltech, the technical college campus, where we crowdfunded millions of rands, and then we built an Afrikaans technical college because the government doesn't care about Afrikaans tertiary education. So we built our own technical college with grassroots funding. We also are currently, this year, we're starting construction on our own university called Academia,
Wow.
which is a 3.2 billion rand project, which
And
also, again,
it's not like an online university. It's a
no,
physical.
so it already exists, but it's currently renting a campus. So it already has thousands of students, but it's renting a campus. And we're currently building our own campus, which we start this year. We already bought the land, so the project
I
has
hope it
already
doesn't get
started.
expropriated.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of the quote from Flip Base, the head of the Solidarity movement, who always says, "The only risk bigger than trying is to do nothing, because when you do nothing, defeat is certain. Right? You
That's
might as
true.
well try and have a chance of winning than just saying, well, whatever I do is always going to fail, so I'm just going to do nothing. Well, then you just doom
Indeed.
yourself to certain defeat." So yeah, that's just scratching the surface of it, but that's what Afrikaners are doing. Is we're demographically concentrating, and we're in places where Afrikaners already live in high concentrations, and then we're creating a de facto reality. And the the motto of the solidarity, one of the mottos, we have two mottos. The one motto is we're building to stay, and the second motto is you don't demand change, you build change. That's how it works.
That's great. All right. We end each of our podcasts with a traditional question. It's a very
Mm-hmm.
long-standing tradition from 3 weeks ago, which is recommend a book. It can be any book outside your area of expertise.
Outside of my area of expertise.
Yes.
Um, hmm,
Fiction, nonfiction, just
hmm.
not contemporary South Africa, I guess.
Right. I would recommend. Huh. There's so many books I'd like to recommend, but they are in Afrikaans, so they're behind a language barrier. But if I had to, because all my favorite books are written in Afrikaans, unfortunately, because then I would, if for some reason you have an Afrikaans listener, jy moet definitief dan moet jy lees Liberale Nasionalisme deur MP van Wyk Lou. Dis definitief die boek wat ek sal voorstel. But if I had to recommend an English work, I would recommend The Great Betrayal by Ian Smith.
Okay.
Because
All right.
history is not my speciality, and that's a fantastical historical account.
Yeah, I've read some of it. It's very interesting. I was not a fan of the prose. It's not an easy to read book.
Yeah.
But I I never finished it, but the parts that I did read, I thought were very interesting. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. I hope people watch this. Is there a way for people outside South Africa to support AfriForum?
Yes. So you can become an international member of AfriForum. The best way to do that is just to go to, I think the best way to find the link for that for international membership would be to go to my YouTube channel called Conscious Caracal, and then to go to the description of my latest stream or latest video, and you'll see there's a link in the description that says become a member or support AfriForum, and you can go there and you can either make a once-off donation or you can become a member. I'll also send you the link to you so you can put it in the description of wherever this will be published. If people want to visit it there, then there will be a link in the
Yes,
description.
I will put all of the links and everything in the description.
Okay,
Don't worry.
so then
All right.
yeah, let me revise that. Then you don't have to go to my channel. You can just find the link to become a international
Yes.
member of AfriForum in the description of this video.
All right. Great. Ernst Van Zyl, thank you very much for your time. I hope people watch this, and I wish the best future possible for all South Africans in all South Africa. Thank you.
Fantastic. Have a nice day. Goodbye.
Bye.